Ever wondered what truly happens inside a hospital after the final visiting hour ends? When the elevators fall silent, the city exhales into sleep and the fluorescent lights hum over corridors meant to be empty, but never quite feel that way. Because tonight, what you're about to hear comes not from imagination, but from those who lived it. And before we begin, welcome to the channel. This is where real encounters, true accounts, and unexplained experiences collide. So if you're drawn to stories that linger long after the screen goes dark, make sure to subscribe and stay with us, because the night shift holds secrets few are willing to talk about, and fewer still are prepared to face, especially in hospitals, where life ends as often as it begins, and where emotions don't simply vanish when the lights dim. Because when midnight arrives, the hospital transforms into a different entity entirely, one where footsteps echo too loudly, where unused wards breathe with cold air, and where even seasoned professionals admit that something changes once the clock crosses 12. As one veteran nurse described her routine rounds beginning with nothing unusual until the call bell rang from room 370 in a room sealed and vacant for weeks, prompting her to check the patient board, confirm the emptiness, and walk the long corridor anyway, her shoes clicking against polished floors as the lights flickered subtly above her. And when she reached the door, the call lights stopped, the room stood empty, and yet the air inside felt occupied, heavy, almost expectant. And as she turned to leave, she heard it again, not a bell this time, but a whisper carried through the ventilation, saying her name in a tone neither urgent nor gentle, but familiar enough to freeze her in place, because hospitals at night aren't just quiet, they're listening. And those who work within them begin to sense patterns, doors that never stay closed, shadows that gather near old nurse stations, and the persistent feeling of being observed from behind frosted glass windows where no one should be standing. And while administrators explain these sensations away as stress or fatigue, the staff know better, because every hospital has sections no one volunteers to patrol. Older wings with outdated equipment, dimmer lighting, and an atmosphere that feels thick with memory, where the temperature drops suddenly and the silence presses inward. And as our story unfolds, you'll hear how the night shift doesn't just reveal medical emergencies, it reveals the hospital itself, stripped of daytime noise, exposing something that moves through its halls with purpose, waiting for witnesses who can't simply walk away. What makes these stories truly unsettling is that they don't come from those inclined towards superstition, but from doctors trained to rely on logic, evidence, and repetition. Like one emergency physician who took over overnight rounds in an aging hospital wing scheduled for renovation, a place known for malfunctioning monitors and unexplained alarms. Though on his third week of nights, the disturbances grew precise, targeted, and deeply personal, beginning with heart monitors activating in empty rooms, for pumps alarming without connection, and overhead paging systems crackling to life with distorted echoes that resembled breathing more than static. And each time, the malfunctions occurred at the same hour, 2:17 a.m., a time later discovered to coincide with a fatal incident decades earlier involving a mass casualty event in that wing. And while the doctor initially dismissed coincidence, his confidence eroded when he encountered a patient chart left open on a workstation, freshly updated with vital signs that matched no living patient in the system. And as he traced the room number, his pulse quickened, because the assigned room no longer existed, removed during structural changes years before. And yet, when he followed the hallway, guided by a growing sense of pressure behind his eyes, he found himself standing before a blank wall where a door frame had once been, and for reasons he still can't explain, he raised his stethoscope and pressed it to the surface, only to hear a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human, prompting him to step back as alarms erupted throughout the wings simultaneously, lights flickering as if responding to something unseen moving rapidly through the corridors. And from that night on, staff reported seeing figures in outdated hospital gowns, standing near supply rooms or seated at the ends of beds that no longer existed, never interacting, never speaking, simply present, as if replaying routines long after their purpose had ended. And one orderly described assisting a confused elderly patient to the restroom, speaking with her calmly, guiding her gently, only to discover moments later that the woman matched the description of a patient who had passed away earlier that evening, her bed now stripped and empty, leaving behind only the echo of her footsteps and the unbearable realization that the hospital docentee always let go, because within its walls, suffering imprints itself deeply. And when night falls, the building remembers, replaying moments not meant to be witnessed again, especially by those who believe they're alone. By the time dawn approaches, those who survive the night shift understand something unspoken, that hospitals are not haunted in the traditional sense, but saturated, layered with residual emotion, fear, hope, grief, and unfinished stories that don't vanish simply because a life has ended. And it's moments like these that blur the line between comfort and terror. Because not all apparitions feel malicious, yet their presence raises a haunting question. If hospitals retain emotional imprints, then what else lingers unseen, and why do some encounters feel watchful, heavy and oppressive, as though something far older and less human moves between the memories, feeding on the stillness? And while skeptics argue stress and exhaustion, the consistency of reports across countries, cultures, and decades tells a different story. One where night shift workers share the same experiences without knowing each other, describing identical figures, sounds, and sensations, suggesting that hospitals act as conduits, places where the boundary between worlds thins under the weight of human vulnerability. And as you sit safely watching this, remember that right now, somewhere, a lone nurse is walking a quiet corridor, a doctor is pausing before a door that shouldn't open, and a shadow is standing perfectly still where no shadow should be. So if you or someone you know has experienced something unexplainable during a hospital night shift, share it in the comments, because these stories matter, and they deserve to be heard. And if you want more real, unsettling accounts from professions that work while the world sleeps, subscribe now and stay connected, because the night doesn't just hide things, it reveals them. And once you know what walks those halls after hours, you may never look at a hospital the same way again. Imagine the sterile silence of a hospital at 3 in the morning, when visiting hours are long over. The city outside is asleep, and the only sounds left are the distant hum of ventilation systems and the soft beeping of monitors keeping vigil over lives hanging in. Delicate balance. And before we go any further, welcome to the channel where real experiences, unexplained encounters, and first-hand accounts take center stage. So if you're drawn to stories that blur the line between reality and the unknown, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because tonight we're stepping into the dimly lit corridors of hospitals after dark, places meant for healing that somehow become something else entirely when the night shift begins. And nurses, more than anyone, know this transformation intimately, because once the lights dim and staffing thins, the hospital feels less like a workplace and more like a living organism, breathing slowly, listening, watching, remembering. And one nurse recalls her first overnight shift as deceptively calm, charting vitals at the nurses' station while the hallway stretched endlessly before her, empty rooms lining each side, until a sudden call bell shattered, the silence flashing insistently from a room marked unoccupied, a room she personally helped prepare earlier that evening. And although every instinct told her not to respond, professionalism compelled her forward footsteps, echoing unnaturally loud as she approached the door, only to find the bed neatly made, lights off, and no sign of a patient. Yet the call bell continued to pulse, refusing to stop until she verbally announced her presence, at which point it fell silent instantly, leaving behind an oppressive quiet that felt heavier than before. And experiences like this are so common among night shift nurses that their VA become unspoken rites of passage, whispered about in break rooms and exchanged through uneasy glances. Because the midnight shift isn't just understaffed, it's emotionally exposed. And with fewer distractions, nurses become acutely aware of subtle changes, the temperature dropping without explanation, the sensation of being followed down long corridors, the uncanny awareness that they're no longer alone, even when every logical indicator insists otherwise. And while administrators chalk it up to fatigue or imagination, those who walk these halls night after night know there's a difference between exhaustion and presence. And the hospital, once bustling and bright, reveals a darker personality after hours, one that nurses learn to respect, fear, and quietly endure. As the night deepens, the experiences escalate beyond malfunctioning equipment into moments that leave even seasoned nurses shaken. Because one of the most disturbing patterns involves voices, soft, deliberate whispers, drifting from empty rooms, calling out names, asking for help, or simply sighing, as if someone is standing just out of sight. And one nurse recounts responding to what she believed was a confused patient, calling her repeatedly from a long-term care wing, only to discover the room had been sealed following a death weeks earlier. Yet the voice continued, growing closer as she backed away, echoing through the corridor without any visible source, while another described doors opening and closing on their own, in secure units requiring badge access, swinging gently as if someone had just passed through, despite security logs showing no entries or exits. And perhaps most unsettling are the visual encounters, moments when nurses briefly glimpse figures standing near supply carts or seated calmly at the ends of beds, appearing solid at first glance, only to vanish when approached directly, leaving behind a lingering chill and a profound sense of intrusion. And one story stands out: a nurse working oncology rounds who noticed a woman in an outdated hospital gown standing near the medication room, hands folded patiently, and assuming she was a lost patient, the nurse spoke to her, receiving a faint smile in response, before stepping away to retrieve assistance. And when she turned back, the hallway was empty. Later discovering through an old photograph in the staff lounge that the little woman closely resembled a former patient who had passed years earlier in that same wing. And these moments don't arrive with dramatic fanfare. They slip quietly into routine, making them all the more terrifying. Because nurses aren't looking for ghosts, they're looking for patients. And when reality doesn't align with expectation, the psychological impact can be profound, leaving professionals questioning not only what they saw, but whether the hospital itself is replaying fragments of its past, as if the walls have absorbed so much pain and longing that it occasionally leaks back into the present. And while skeptics argue environmental factors, lighting, fatigue, stress, the consistency of these reports across departments, hospitals, and even countries suggests something far more complex, something that thrives in the silence between heartbeats and the dim spaces between overhead lights. For nurses who experience these encounters, the hardest part isn't the fear itself, but learning to function alongside it. Because once you've heard footsteps pacing behind you in an empty corridor, or felt a cold hand brush past your arm when no one was there, the hospital never feels the same again. And many nurses admit they cope by forming quiet support networks, sharing stories in hushed tones during breaks, gauging reactions carefully to avoid judgment, because officially, there's no checkbox for the unexplainable in incident reports. And yet these experiences leave lasting impressions, influencing how nurses approach certain rooms, avoid specific hallways, or feel an unshakable sense of unease at particular times of night. And some believe these phenomena are tied to intentions of Marnochis, and something that watchers observes emotion of their sessions, of something that watchers observe us, unscrunch something summons up similling by, creeps inficant pleasings, and suppliant spends, and walks-ins and well, simpsons and then were, and el were kukusa, or with the hoe with our work, with quapic work with people sweep by power, like we cool has stack with whoopers, we blow out of car, sex a hook to cascas of the wax, who stow bows, still walks free, and occasionally interacts, especially with those who are most vulnerable or most attentive. And one nurse reflected that despite the terror, she never felt these presences meant harm, only recognition, as if the hospital remembers those who cared, those who suffered, and those who never truly left. And as dawn approaches and sunlight slowly reclaims the corridors, the tension eases, but the memory lingers. Because nurses carry these experiences home with them, tucked behind professionalism and routine, knowing that when night falls again, the hospital will awaken in its own way. And before we end this final round, we want to hear from you. Have you or someone you know experienced something unexplainable in a hospital or workplace after dark? Share your story in the comments, because these voices deserve space. And if you made it through this journey into the shadows, support the channel by liking this video, subscribing for more true spine-chilling accounts, and ringing the notification bell so you don't miss our next descent into the unknown. Because some places never truly sleep, and some stories refuse to stay silent. Imagine the moment when the clock slips past midnight and the world quietly withdraws. Streets empty, phones stop ringing, and familiar daytime rhythms dissolve into an unnerving stillness. And before we step any further into that silence, welcome to the channel, a place dedicated to real encounters, psychological mysteries, and the unexplained experiences that surface when humanity steps aside. So if you're fascinated by what hides beneath routine and darkness alike, make sure to subscribe and stay connected, because tonight we're going beyond the clock into the lonely world of night shifts, a realm that doesn't simply operate on different hours but exists under entirely different rules, where isolation magnifies every sound and absence becomes oppressive. And for those who work through the night, nurses, factory operators, security guards, cleaners, and lone technicians, the shift doesn't just feel quieter, it feels watched, as though the spaces they occupy are acutely aware of being observed. And many night workers describe the same unsettling transformation: how buildings feel larger, corridors longer, shadows deeper, and time itself stretches unnaturally, blurring minutes into hours. And one hospital orderly recalled how the silence wasn't empty at all but layered, humming softly with distant machinery, ventilation, and something else he couldn't identify, a presence that seemed to grow stronger the further the night advanced. Because when people leave, places don't sleep, they remember, and stripped of human noise, they begin to express themselves in subtle, disquieting ways, making night shift workers question whether they are experiencing the side effects of fatigue or brushing against something far less explainable, something that emerges only when the world stops paying attention. As the hours deepen, auditory anomalies are often the first fracture in reality, because sound travels differently at night, and in the absence of constant activity, even the smallest noise feels deliberate, purposeful. And one factory technician described hearing rhythmic footsteps pacing the upper floor of a manufacturing plant long after production had ended, slow, measured steps that matched no human pattern and stopped whenever he paused to listen, resuming only when he moved again. While a night shift nurse recounted responding to whispered conversations drifting from an unused ward, voices layered over one another in tones too soft to understand, yet unmistakably human, only to find the lights off, beds stripped, and no sign of recent entry. And when sound alone no longer explains the dread, visual disturbances begin to surface, fleeting shadows crossing doorways, reflections in glass that lag just a second too long, and figures glimpsed in peripheral vision that vanish when looked at directly, such as the security guard who swore he saw a man standing motionless beside an elevator bank in an empty office building, only to find the hallway completely vacant upon approach, leaving behind a cold heaviness in the air and the overwhelming sensation of intrusion. And these experiences are uniquely terrifying because they unfold without witnesses, without validation, forcing the mind to grapple with an impossible choice: accept a rational explanation that doesn't quite fit, or acknowledge that something outside normal understanding may be intruding into reality. And over time, this uncertainty erodes confidence, making night workers hyper-aware of every sensation, every flicker of light, every unexplained movement, as solitude becomes both companion and adversary, amplifying fear not through spectacle, but through the relentless absence of reassurance. Eventually, many night shift workers describe reaching a stage where the fear is no longer tied to specific events but to an overwhelming sense of presence, the unmistakable feeling of being observed, followed, or silently evaluated, even in wide-open spaces. And one nurse explained how certain hallways carried an unshakable pressure, a weight in the chest that intensified without warning, accompanied by sudden drops in temperature or faint, unfamiliar scents that appeared and vanished instantly. while a warehouse cleaner described moments when the air felt thick and resistant, as if pushing through invisible boundaries that hadn't existed during daylight hours, leading many to wonder whether these experiences are psychological artifacts of isolation and disrupted sleep cycles, or evidence that night itself reveals layers of reality, usually drowned out by human activity. And while science offers partial explanations, sensory deprivation, heightened pattern recognition, stress responses, it fails to fully account for the consistency of reports across professions, locations, and cultures, suggesting that something universal occurs when human presence withdraws en masse. And as dawn finally approaches, light seeps back into these spaces, dissolving shadows and restoring familiar proportions. Yet for those who lived through the night, the memory lingers, a quiet understanding that something was there, something patient, waiting just beyond perception. And before we end this final watch, we want to hear from you. Have you ever worked a night shift or experienced something unexplainable in profound solitude? Share your story in the comments below, because these experiences deserve to be acknowledged. And if you made it through beyond the clock, support the channel by liking this video, subscribing for more true encounters from the edges of reality, and turning on notifications, because when the world sleeps, something else wakes, and not everyone who meets it is prepared to talk about what they saw.